We don't want this as African people anymore. We are tired of seeing African migrants moving all over the world, refusing to fix your own countries.
If we set a benchmark for a basic GDP per capita of a not so poor economy of $10,000 per year, the entire mainland continent of Africa falls below that threshold. Let's compare that to Asia. While many countries still fall below the line, several countries rise above it. The Americas and Europe have the largest percentage of countries with GDP per capita above the $10,000 threshold. This visual represents a developmental world that over 1 billion people have been hitting for decades. It is a stagnation that fuels the common rhetoric we hear today, the demand for migrants to go back and fix their own countries.
This is our country! You should be here standing with us!
He's a citizen! He's a citizen!
Tina, we don't want you here. We want you to fix your countries.
So today we are looking at the data to see if indeed these people can fix their countries and cross that poverty line. But to get to that answer, we need to understand what wealth even looks like and why some countries, especially in Africa, still remain poor. When we talk about rich countries, the first problem we run into is that nobody really agrees on what rich even means, because wealth is a constantly moving target. About 30 years ago, only wealthy people could afford mobile phones. Today, billions of people own one, including some of the poorest people on earth. But nobody would seriously argue that everybody is now rich. So where exactly do we draw the line? Is a country rich when the people can afford to buy a home or a car or go on vacation whenever they want? Or is a country rich when the people can afford basic food and shelter? Because the more you think about it, the more difficult the question becomes. Wealth can be taken in two forms: absolute and relative wealth. Relative wealth changes constantly depending on society and the period in history. While Europe is rich on average, Germany is obviously wealthier than Poland, but that doesn't make Poland a poor country, because the people can afford food and shelter and the government has a budget to spend on infrastructure and welfare. The same thing can be said for Africa. While South Africa is relatively poorer than the wealthy nations, it is significantly richer than a country like Sudan. So the question is no longer whether a country is poorer than another, but whether they can consistently afford the basic necessities of life: food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and education. If your grandfather in the 1950s struggled to afford 3 meals a day, a decent shelter or proper clothing, and 70 years later you still struggle to afford those same basic necessities, then in absolute terms your quality of life has not meaningfully improved. And that is the kind of poverty we want to find out if every single country can grow out from. In practical terms, we can think about it as an economy having a productive capacity per person of around $10,000 annually, roughly the lower end of an upper middle income economy. At this level, poverty doesn't disappear. It is simply the point where we can say an economy has reached a baseline where people can access the basic requirements of modern life, and where development becomes sustainable rather than being one pandemic away from total collapse. Africa is perhaps the clearest example of this. Across most of the continent, large parts of the population still live below the poverty line. In fact, only 2 African countries have a GDP per capita above $10,000, and these are tiny island nations. Compare that to 7 in the Middle East, 9 in South America, and 12 in Asia. And while poor countries exist on every continent, there is still nowhere else that poverty exists at this scale across so many neighboring economies all at once, which makes Africa the clearest case studies for understanding why countries remain poor and whether they can eventually change. Systems and institutions play a massive role in how societies function and how economies grow. Because for an economy to become rich, people need to become productive. And people are most productive when they specialize. A person does not need to be an accountant, a doctor, a mechanic, and a lawyer all at once. They can specialize in one thing, earn money from it, and rely on other people who specialize in other things they cannot do themselves. But the whole process only works if trust exists. If the accountant believes the doctor is unqualified, or the doctor cannot get his car fixed by the mechanic, then the system breaks down, and this is playing out in most of the countries on the continent. If a student feels years of studying will eventually mean nothing because jobs depend on bribery or political connections, then there is little incentive to work hard, innovate, and develop expertise in the first place. Every system is built on trust, and it translates to the government. The people have to believe that the government is using their taxes to fund projects that is in their best interest. The clearest example is perhaps Denmark. It operates on very high taxes, but the population is generally willing to pay those taxes because people trust where the money goes. There is transparency, and because the institutions function properly, the country becomes more productive. Now, would the Danish model work perfectly for every country? Probably not. The point is, Denmark is just one model of prosperity. The United States became the wealthiest country in history on a gross level through a very different system: low welfare spending, stronger private sector dominance, and a far more market-driven economy. China, on the other hand, chose yet another model, a socialist market economy. While this system places far heavy emphasis on government ownership, state coordination, and central planning, and operates under a far more authoritarian style of governance, it still has experienced one of the fastest periods of economic growth in human history. Yet, despite their differences, all these systems still rely on the same underlying foundation: institutions. Because regardless of whether a country chose a welfare-heavy Scandinavian model, a market-oriented capitalist one, or a state-directed socialist market economy, long-term prosperity still depends on whether people trust the system enough to work, invest, innovate, and plan for the future. Institutions are the systems that make sure different parts of the society functions the way they are supposed to. You have courts, laws, educational systems, property rights, governments, and financial systems. When these institutions work properly, people are more willing to cooperate and specialize. And when they stop functioning properly, economic coordination itself begins to collapse. In simple terms, much of the poverty in Africa is not simply about a lack of resource or intelligence, but weak political and economic institutions that fail to create incentives for long-term productivity and investment. And while colonization played a role, it still doesn't fully explain why many of these systems remain in place today. Across large parts of Africa, investment in even basic farming technology remains a challenge. In many rural communities, herd potterage is still a major part of agricultural work, and productivity barely improves. If a farmer in a rural community still relies on carrying water on the head to irrigate crops, then there is only so much water that person can realistically move in a day, as compared to, say, a simple hand trolley. In some cases, a farmer today can clear weeds and plant seeds at the same scale as a farmer could in the 1800s, simply because both are still relying on nearly the same manual tools. And the infrastructure often does little to help. Roads from rural communities are frequently designed around getting goods to urban markets, but barely connect farming communities to one another in ways that allow them to share tools and technology. The structure largely remains the same, and across Africa as an economic bloc, the effects are still widespread. Land tenure is a major issue. Farmers can spend years developing land only for mining concessions to suddenly threaten that investment with little or no legal recourse. And when people are uncertain whether they will keep the land they improve, long-term investment becomes far less attractive. Law enforcement often functions unevenly. Transparency remains weak, and many public institutions simply fail to create the level of trust necessary for long-term economic coordination. In simple terms, the institutions often do not work well enough to consistently award productivity, investment, and long-term development, and the result is the widespread poverty. While poverty is deeply systemic, it is important to understand that solving the underlying causes of poverty can, in theory, allow poorer countries to become significantly wealthier over time. In economics, one of the most influential ideas related to this is known as the catch-up effect. The theory predicts that poorer countries should, over time, grow faster than richer ones, eventually narrowing the income gap between them. The logic is relatively straightforward. Rich countries often spend decades researching and developing new technologies, infrastructure, industrial systems, and production methods. Poorer countries, however, do not necessarily need to reinvent those systems from scratch. They can simply adopt technologies and methods that already exist. A poorer agricultural economy does not need to spend decades researching advanced farming machinery before increasing productivity. It can import tractors, irrigation systems, fertilizers, and harvesting equipment that already exist elsewhere. And because of that, productivity can theoretically increase much faster. The same principle applies across the wider economy. Renewable energy, transport systems, and industrial machinery can all be adopted far more quickly than they were originally developed. In theory, this allows poorer countries to grow faster than already developed economies. And in many cases, this has already happened. Parts of Asia experienced extremely rapid economic growth over the last few decades by adopting existing technologies and integrating into the global system. But this hasn't been the case across Africa. While total GDP has often grown at rates comparable to the developed world, GDP per capita growth tells a very different story. In sub-Saharan Africa, per person economic growth has actually been negative on average over the past decade. If nothing fundamentally changes, countries like Nigeria and South Africa may never catch up to the developed economies, and in fact, they may further fall behind because their GDP per capita has been growing in the negatives. Convergence has happened before in places like South Korea, Singapore, and Thailand, but those success stories depended on much more than simply adopting existing technologies. Because copying technology alone is not enough. A country may have access to modern technology, but if the right systems are not put in place, then productivity gains becomes much harder to sustain. And this is where many developing economies continue to struggle. Nigeria remains heavily dependent on oil. Trust in the economy is non-existent because of its reputation in the cybercrime space, and political instability is still a threat. Ghana is destroying itself for gold, and Sudan is still at war. And at the same time, there are also examples of institutional progress. Botswana has developed some of the strongest governance institutions on the continent, while Rwanda has undergone significant reconstruction and state building after one of the darkest periods in modern African history. So, the future is not entirely pessimistic, but realistically, catching up to the living standards of the richest economies will likely take far longer than many of us might want. Poverty can decline and infrastructure can improve, and many African economies will almost certainly become wealthier over time. But reaching the economic level of countries like Singapore, Denmark, or the United States across the continent within our lifetime is unlikely.